welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another deeper dive into the archive. Today I'm taking a look at an unusual aspect of the state's history. It starts back near the day when Florida became a U.S. territory, and it happened in part of Florida few people pay much attention to. In a series of fascinating events that occurred over 89 years, there's a larger story that defines the local politics and economy. Some of the state's most rural counties lie along the Interstate 10 corridor between Jacksonville and Tallahassee. The 5 counties that I-10 passes through, along with 4 adjacent counties, have a population of 236,000. That's just 1% of Florida's population, even though it's almost 10% of the land. I'm taking a look at 4 of those counties and how they were created.
Baker, Bradford, Columbia, and Union counties are considered part of the Jacksonville area and were initially part of St. Johns County when the U.S. took possession of Florida in 1821. Prior to becoming part of the U.S., Florida was under Spanish control and was split into 2 colonies, East and West Florida. They were governed from St. Augustine and Pensacola, which are the 2 oldest cities in the state. Under the U.S., the Florida Territory maintained that division and named them for 2 rivers, St. Johns and Escambia. The difference between Spanish and U.S. control was that the Spanish colonies were split at the Apalachicola River, while the U.S. counties used the Suwannee as the border. And this would be 30 years before Stephen Foster made the Suwannee famous in the minstrel song Old Folks at Home. By the way, note that when the U.S. got Florida, they gave part of the coast to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. That's why the Spanish Florida panhandle looks too long. Imagine, Florida could have had the ports of Jacksonville, Miami, and Tampa, as well as Mobile and New Orleans. Florida's 2-county setup didn't last long, as Americans were eager to settle the new territory. Indeed, within the first decade, nearly 40,000 Americans migrated to Florida, though 45% of that population were enslaved individuals. Settlements popped up, land was claimed by families, and subsequently 13 additional counties were created in the first 6 years. Not surprisingly, the Georgia border area saw the greatest growth. In 1832, Columbia, the 14th county, was formed by splitting off land from Alachua County. Named for Christopher Columbus, today it's still on the state line, though it's quite a bit smaller. It's in Columbia County our story begins. One of the first white settlements after the U.S. took possession of Florida was Alligator, named after the Seminole village of Alligator, located nearby. 2 years later, the Seminoles were forced to move to a reservation further southward. This left the white settlers and their slaves on their own, and Alligator was made the seat of Columbia County. In 1858, the railroad arrived from Jacksonville, and Alligator moved away from being a frontier town. It was incorporated the next year, and the locals decided that the town should have a more mainstream name. There's several versions of how and why it happened, with basically all of them connected with how so many locals preferred a less rustic name. In 1859, Alligator became Lake City. No offense to the residents, but I wish they'd change it back. Like nearly all buildings in Florida's early years, Columbia's first courthouses were log structures. Each of the courthouses was built at the center of town next to what would become a lusty park, though few records survive that give any real detail. We know that there were 3 successive log courthouses prior to 1867. Oddly enough, they are better known for their demise rather than their beginning. All 3 burned to the ground. That would be in 1848, 1860, and 1867. Not only had the courthouses burned, most of the county records did as well, since they were housed in the burning structures. There's no proof as to how the courthouses caught on fire, though it's thought that each was arson. While proof has been lost to time, that's not the case with the next Columbia courthouse. Built after the 1867 fire, it was yet again a log building and is thought to have 2 rooms and a broad porch. It survived only 7 years, and this time we're certain it was the victim of arson. It's believed that the arsonists were locals who had been accused of hog rustling, if you can rustle hogs. They were under the impression that if the indictment, the document that charged them with their crimes, was destroyed, their criminal case couldn't proceed. The county documents were held in the courthouse, and just days before Christmas 1874, the courthouse burned down. While the individuals were still tried for hog rustling, it appears that there wasn't enough evidence to charge them with arson, and I've not been able to discover if they were even found guilty for the original charges. The next courthouse, a wood frame building, wouldn't be built until 1876, but at least that one didn't catch fire. It was eventually replaced with the current courthouse, which was built in the same general location. Completed in 1902, according to plans by the architect Frank Pierce Milburn, the courthouse is the only example of Beaux Arts or neoclassic architecture in Lake City. Now, if you look at some online sources, you'll see that the courthouse was built as late as 1906, though the 1902 date is the correct one. For example, it's in the original document submitted to the National Historic Landmarks Program. It's one of the buildings included in the Lake City Historic Commercial District. The building it replaced was cut in half, moved to 2 different lots, and rebuilt into 2 different houses. Today, Columbia County's population is around 73,000, with Lake City having around 12,000 residents. The town was the birthplace of Florida Agricultural College in 1884, the state's first land-grant college. In 1905, FAC would be moved to Gainesville and become part of the newly organized University of Florida. The next county was created in 1858 and named New River. Now, if you thought you knew all of the state's 67 counties and you're unfamiliar with New River County, don't worry. It didn't last very long with that title. Named after the New River that runs in the south of the county and makes up part of Columbia County's border, it was created by cleaving off the eastern part of that county and a small part of Alachua. Barely 2 years later, and less than a month after Florida seceded from the U.S. at the start of the Civil War, New River County would be split, creating Baker County on the north side with New River on the south, becoming the smallest county in the state. This happened during a time when you'd think the legislature would be busy. Florida not only withdrew from the U.S. only 15 years after achieving statehood, it proclaimed itself as a sovereign and independent nation in its order of succession. It later joined the Confederacy and began to attend to war efforts. As for the name change, that happened a bit later. New River would get changed to Bradford County in December of 1861. It was named for Captain Richard Bradford, a Confederate killed in October during the failed attempt to capture Fort Pickens near Pensacola. Known as the Battle of Santa Rosa Island, a force of 1,200 Confederates attacked the fort and 600 Union soldiers, but they were repelled. Bradford was the first officer from Florida to die in the Civil War. With its seat located in the small town of Lake Butler, the county remained unchanged for only 3 years. But I'll get back to Bradford County in a bit. I want to look at the other New River County, that of Baker. Originally from North Carolina, James McNair Baker was a lawyer and politician. He moved to Florida in the 1840s, arriving in Alligator. In fact, he's supposed to have been one of the people who lobbied for a less rustic name. He was elected state judge and was honored by the legislature, naming the newest county for him. Prior to secession, it's believed that he didn't support Florida leaving the Union, though once it occurred, he changed his stance and in 1862 would be selected to be one of Florida's senators to the Confederate States Congress. Baker County is the location of part of the Osceola National Forest and a small part of the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. Like the other counties in this video, it's the home of pine forests and cypress wetlands, both of which have been economically valuable in Florida since the early 1800s. The original county seat was the village of Sanderson, settled in 1859. At the time, there was only about 1,000 people living in the new county, most of them around Sanderson, which was the site of the Burnstead Blockhouse, an unusual structure thought to be built in 1837 at the order of then-President Andrew Jackson. A blockhouse is a small fortification that is designed to withstand attacks by forces with only small arms, such as rifles. Named after settler James Burnstead, it was built to protect the locals from the indigenous Seminole community not long after the start of the Second Seminole War. While it's log built, the logs were squared off, which gave the house the appearance of a structure finished with quarter sawn lumber, but the exterior walls were up to 10 inches or 25 centimeters square, rendering them bulletproof. The corners of the beams were joined with full dovetails, making the corners of the house as strong as the rest. Built entirely of local yellow pine, there were rifle slits to allow those inside to fire in any direction. Some of the logs were designed with saw cuts that would make larger gun ports if they were knocked out. Since the house never saw any real action, the knockouts were never used. Placed high in the walls, windows are square or rectangular openings with hinged board shutters. While the house is 2 stories high, only the lower floor was ever lived in. Sanderson was also the location of Baker's first courthouse, made of logs, in 1861. In 1877, the courthouse was destroyed by fire and the county records were lost. It's unknown as to the cause of the fire. A group of people from nearby Darbyville pushed to have the county seat moved there, and in 1886 a vote was held, with a majority of 243 over 220 voting to move it. It may not seem to be a big deal, but the fact is that the location of the county government had a large economic and political impact on whatever town was the seat. Development of that town would accelerate, resulting in an increase in population, investments, industry, and political influence. Darbyville was named for the Darby family who owned much of the land in and around the village. Later, a Mr. Carr McClenny married into the Darby family, bought most of the family's property, and developed a timber and turpentine business. Darbyville's name would be changed to McClenny, spelt like this on the former train depot, though it would change its spelling to this. It's thought that this was to conform to a postal regulation prohibiting capitalized letters in the middle of post office names. Even today, McClenny is a quiet, small city of about 7,000, though it's less than 30 miles from the center of Jacksonville. Nonetheless, McClenny is the largest population center in the county. In 1900, yet another Baker County courthouse, a wood-framed building, was destroyed by fire, and most of the county's records were destroyed as well. By 1909, a brick Romanesque revival courthouse was built and used until the end of World War II. A newer courthouse, another red brick building of classical revival style, began construction in 1940, but due to the war wasn't completed until 1948. It's possible that this was the last courthouse built in Florida using a design based on Greek or Roman architecture. After the war, the design of courthouses embraced the modern aesthetic and materials. The 1948 courthouse remains Baker's courthouse today, and the previous brick courthouse was converted for use as the local library. Now let's get back to Bradford. The seat of the county when it was created was the recently settled village of Lake Butler. Both it and Butler Lake are named for Robert Butler, a colonel in the U.S. Army serving as Andrew Jackson's adjutant. He was acting governor of East Florida once the U.S. took possession of the territory, though he only served for 2 days, as he was waiting for the arrival of John Bell, the next acting governor. Shortly afterwards, the territory of East Florida was changed to St. Johns County and no longer needed a governor. As I've already mentioned, several of the early courthouses in Columbia County were destroyed due to arson. Also, Baker County saw the seat move from Sanderson to McClenny due to a dispute. McClenny has remained the seat ever since. Now, as you'll see, the early history of Bradford County included arson, lawsuits, and rigged votes. Though only 14 miles apart, the towns of Lake Butler and Stark engaged in a prolonged fight on a scale unlike any other rivalry between Florida towns. The town of Stark began growing rapidly before the Civil War. Once the war was over, soldiers returned home and new settlers streamed into the state, and Stark continued to grow, especially since it was on the line of the Atlantic to Gulf Railroad. Eventually, the residents began looking to Lake Butler, which held the courthouse, and local politics got intense. As I mentioned earlier, towns that are county seats typically end up with more political influence and economic power. For example, as of 2024, only 10 of Florida's 67 counties have a county seat that's not the most populous town or city. More power and influence meant more money, especially in the 19th century. Only a month after the end of the Civil War, Bradford's first courthouse was destroyed by fire in May of 1865. And yes, nearly all the records burned in the fire as well. It's thought that the courthouse was torched to prevent further investigation of a murder or to destroy pertinent records. A decade later, around Christmas in 1874, 314 registered voters petitioned the county to move the seat to Stark. A month later, a special election was held with the majority voting to move it. The margin of victory was 46 votes, but there were also accusations that the count wasn't legitimate. Meanwhile, only a few weeks later, the second courthouse went up in flames, this time likely because of the conflict. And yes, all records were lost. In 1876, the seat moved to Stark, though Lake Butler was able to obtain a restraining order to prevent a courthouse from being built in Stark. Because of this, the county rented the second floor of a mercantile building in Stark, owned by a Tom Hemingway. That operated as the courthouse. A lawsuit was also filed to contest the results of the special election, and Judge Archibald of the 4th District Court subsequently ruled that it wasn't valid due to the irregularities of the counting process. This meant that Stark was the seat for just 2 years, as by 1878 it had been moved back to Lake Butler. This was when a 4th courthouse was built, or was it a 3rd? Do I count the rented rooms in Stark? Another petition to move the county seat was presented in 1885. At this point, the county board ordered that the courthouse in Lake Butler be protected by a night guard for the month before the election to prevent yet more arson. One might wonder why it took that long, considering all the burned courthouses in the area. I've told you about 7 courthouses, most of which were likely victims of arson. When the special election was completed, Lake Butler had won the right to retain the county seat. The vote was 648 to 629, only a 19-vote difference. 2 years passed until, once again, a petition for a vote was presented. While some argued that the 1885 election should have been the final one, others argued that the vote was illegal and not binding. Yet another argument was that since a court had found the first vote invalid, but no court had ruled on the second one, it must be legal. The vote happened in August 1887 after an injunction to stop it failed in the courts. The vote saw Stark retake the county seat, this time with 590 votes for Stark and 557 for Lake Butler. County offices were once again moved 14 miles east, and yes, they moved into rented quarters. County officials occupied the stark Masonic Red Man's Hall. 11 years passed without any significant conflict, but in 1898, a fourth petition came before the county board. On Election Day 1889, a new record turnout was recorded. Stark was again the winner with 1,255 votes to Lake Butler's 1,015. Along with the vote, a provision was included that stated another vote couldn't be presented for the next 20 years. A new courthouse was built in Stark in 1902, and while it was the sixth courthouse for Bradford County, it was the first courthouse building in Stark. That courthouse at the intersection of Call and Temple Streets is of Romanesque Revival design and is a two-story structure built of red brick, limestone trim, and concrete. There's a square brick clock tower and a steep green-colored roof. The first-story windows are arched and along the roofline, as are two dormers. It cost the county $12,500, and today it's the home of Santa Fe Community College. Was that the end of Bradford's county seat issues? There's not only more to the Bradford County story, I've got a final county to tell you about. It's Union County, which is Florida's smallest in area, though there are 7 counties with smaller populations. I was visiting Union County a couple of months ago, and I wandered into the Union County Museum on the second floor of the old Townsend building. I happened upon a staff member, Peggy Kaysen, and we talked for a while. That's the best way to learn stuff. Talk to people. I mentioned that I have this channel, and at one point she asked what kind of video I'd make about that area, and I said I didn't have anything planned. There was one thing about Union County that I was curious about, however, and I asked her, why was Union County created so late in the state's history? See, Union County was formed in 1921. While that's over 100 years ago, remember that that's in the part of the state that was settled at the start. Columbia County was formed in 1832, New River, 1858, Baker and Bradford, 1861. Union, however, was one of the final 13 counties, and nearly all the rest divided up the southwest of Florida in the 1920s. Collier, Henry, Sarasota, Charlotte, Glades, Hardy, and Highlands counties. So why was Union created so late? Of course, Peggy knew the answer, and the story I learned is the one I'm telling you. I just went further back in time since there was a large amount of drama in the Union County region long before there was a Union County. To pick the story up again, the residents of Bradford County had fought to relocate the county seat for 40 years. 1899 saw Stark retain the privilege, and a new courthouse, Stark's first, was built. And remember, the county wasn't supposed to revisit the issue for 20 years. I suppose the Lake Butler residents tried to remain patient, but only 11 years later they tried again. But their plan of attack was completely different. This time, they attempted to get the state legislature involved by having them divide Bradford County in two, so that Lake Butler could be an uncontested county seat. Knowing some of the area's history, the legislature was hesitant to introduce a bill without requiring a vote of Bradford residents. Because of that, the people of Lake Butler chose not to have the bill introduced, and so no vote was held, neither in Bradford County nor in Tallahassee. In 1921, Lake Butler tried one more time, and they were able to persuade a state senator and 2 representatives to introduce a bill that would divide the county, with the New River being the border. They also submitted a petition signed by voters in the county in support of the division. The Stark supporters grew up counter-petitions because of course they did. The parties met in Stark, details were hammered out, and legislation was formally drafted. It passed through the legislature, and newly elected Governor Carey Hardy signed it into law. By the way, Governor Hardy also has a county named for him, and interestingly, he signed it into existence, and that happened less than a month before Union County's creation. So finally we have the last county of the story. Bradford was already a small county, and today it's the third smallest in the state. At least the fight between Stark and Lake Butler was over. Now the only question is, how did Union County get its name? Union stands for unity and pays homage to the newly found unity after years of strife and division. Personally, I think it's a rather iconic aspect of Florida history. The only way to end the Bradford County strife was to divide the county in two. Hardly a union. Upon the start of Union County, the courts rented space in the Townsend Building, the drugstore of J.W. Townsend. Built in the 1890s, it's a two-story red brick structure in the vernacular style. It once was part of a row of retail buildings, but the others have been demolished. Today, the upper floor is the home of the Union County History Museum. 2 years after Union County began, it got its first courthouse building, though Lake Butler had been home to 3 others already. The 1924 courthouse was a compact 2-story wooden building that cost $4,200. Its most distinctive feature was the metal siding on the exterior. While I've seen it described as corrugated iron, that's incorrect. First of all, corrugation means a series of ridges and furrows like this. As you can see, the courthouse walls were covered with panels that look more like large bricks. In the Guide to Florida's Historic Architecture, published in 1989 by the University of Florida Press, it's correctly described as embossed metal siding. The siding is original to the building and is similar to the siding on this 1886 Rogers building in downtown Orlando. The siding of the Rogers building has been identified as pressed zinc and is, as you might guess, made out of zinc. Plus, it's been used to protect what is the only remaining wood-framed building in Orlando. Zinc is lighter and easier to work with than iron and is rust-resistant. The large porch on the front of the building was added later, probably when the county turned it over to the Women's Club. That happened in 1936 when a new courthouse was to be built. Since the county wanted to keep the courthouse in the center of Lake Butler, the former courthouse was moved from the location on Main Street northward about 3 blocks. The new courthouse was of classical revival design and made out of red brick with white limestone elements. It has 2 stories, and while it has been enlarged, the center portion is much as it was when it was completed. Built in the midst of the Great Depression, it was mostly funded by President Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, and it cost $35,000.
So that's the story of 4 of Florida's counties and conflict around the locations of county seats. The old and current courthouses I presented are all interesting parts of Florida's history, while Columbia, Baker, Bradford, and Union counties aren't automatically high on must-see lists for tourists. There's quite a lot to see. There's 3 state parks, a state trail, and many other natural areas protected by the state and country. When you're in the area, please check out the towns, their historic places, and the stories of their early years. Think about how the settlers dealt with the strife and competition as they developed the southernmost frontier of America. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed this look into Florida's early growth and 19th century politics. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more on Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.